So I'm going to walk you through the evolution of what I call the narrative that's led to the foundation for this new norm. It starts with a convention that was passed on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. It's called the Genocide Convention, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. This convention came into force in January of 1951, and it acknowledged that the genocide itself, these are acts committed with the sole intent of destroying, in whole or in part, an entire ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. This act of genocide, whether committed in times of peace or in times of war, ought to be punishable under customary international law. The second stage in this evolution of this normative development is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I'm sure many of you here are familiar with. I know Jerry Ball, our president of the John Humphrey Center, spent a lot of time educating Canadians, especially younger Canadians and younger Albertans, about the merits of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. This declaration was passed in the United Nations General Assembly in December 10, 1948, and it affirmed the inalienable right of all human beings to life, dignity, and freedom. It was followed by twin covenants. The covenants that deal with civil and political rights, the protection of civil and political rights, and the other one that deals with the protection of economic and social rights. Then there was a proclamation made in Tehran, in Iran, in May 1968, which reaffirmed the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and called on all peoples and governments of the world to redouble their efforts to provide for all human beings a life consonant with freedom and dignity and conducive to physical, mental, social, and spiritual welfare. Now, the importance of that particular proclamation was that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was not just limited to Western countries, as many people thought. There was, in fact, a lot of Western influence in the drafting of that declaration. But the fact that Asian and African and Arab states had bought into it with the Tehran Proclamation was significant in terms of understanding the universality of human rights. The next evolution in this normative architecture is a convention on the non-applicability of statutory limitations to war crimes and crimes against humanity. This particular convention, adopted in 1968 with the United Nations General Assembly resolution, basically argued that state parties should not apply statutory limitations to people who commit atrocious crimes. I think that's a very significant thing, because we're not just talking about the governments of states or the state governments themselves, but individuals within the state leaders, military leaders, and so on, who may commit these types of crimes. It was recognized that war crimes and crimes against humanity were among the gravest of crimes in international law. And as such, those who commit those crimes ought to be punished and not protected by statutory limitations. So that means that people like Charles Taylor, who commits egregious crimes in Liberia and Sierra Leone, eventually gets caught and gets sent to a criminal court to answer for his crimes. It means that people like Milosevic, who thought he would never be captured by the international community, gets caught and sent to the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague. Then there was the Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights, which was affirmed in September 1981. And what's interesting about this particular Universal Declaration was that it was compiled by eminent Muslim scholars and jurists. And they did this within the context of the Quran and the Sunnah. Within it was the principle that no one suspected of committing crimes against peace, war crimes, or crimes against humanity would be given asylum. So very similar to the previous declaration. We should not harbor these individuals who commit those types of crimes. The next stage of the evolution was what they call the right of humanitarian intervention, what's called the duty to intervene. At the end of the Cold War, you recall that the United Nations Security Council had authorized a number of coercive and non-coercive interventions around the world to stop mass killings and to stop associated crimes committed against humanity. Some of these interventions were done without the consent of target states. So one example would be Bosnia and save havens in Bosnia. And when the UN was not able to act, NATO as an organization acted. And Professor Keaton, who is here, is our Vice Dean at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Arts. He's written substantially about this particular development, the humanitarian intervention that occurred after the end of the Cold War in order to bring an end to some of these slaughters. But Kosovo raised questions about the legitimacy of intervention in the sovereign states. And I think the answer to that question about whether or not we can intervene in sovereign states lies in the invocation of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which basically proves to us that sovereignty is not absolute. Sovereignty is relative. States who claim to be sovereign and are not able to protect the people within their own borders cannot longer have claims to sovereignty. And Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, in fact, allows for intervention under certain circumstances. Intervention when there are threats to the peace, intervention when there are massive violations of human rights. And that's clearly part of the principle of the United Nations Charter. Yet there were still instances of genocides and mass killings, despite the right of intervention, of humanitarian intervention. So the United Nations tried, and the international community tried to bring about a non-coercive, a non-violent way of ending some of these slaughters by introducing sanctions. The 1990s is considered to be the sanctions decade because there were more sanctions during that decade than any other time in the history of the United Nations. And these sanctions are coercion short of war. Economic sanctions, blockades, in some cases arms embargoes. And this seems to be less objectionable than a strategy that allowed for military intervention for humanitarian purposes. But sanctions were discredited because most of the time, the generalized sanctions tended to hurt people within states rather than the leaders who may have perpetrated the violence within states. So innocent and the weak, in places like Iraq, remember the oil for food scandal in Iraq, the Iraqi government was able to get away with murder, essentially, as sanctions were being imposed on Iraq, and those sanctions hurt the children of Iraq, the women of Iraq, the poor in Iraq, rather than the government itself. Saddam Hussein and his sons were doing very well. In fact, we're thriving on the sanctions regime. So the international community introduced what's called smart sanctions. These are sanctions that are aimed, targeted at the perpetrators of violence, whether they be state leaders, whether they be military leaders, targeting their pocketbooks, targeting their accounts in Switzerland, targeting their children who may want to get an education in the West, targeting their travel. And these smart sanctions, I think, were improvements on the more generalized sanctions. But there are still problems in trying to implement those sanctions to stop these kinds of crimes, these core crimes that we're talking about today.